Hello, so this is the really last major lecture of the year. I'll give you a little lecture on Wednesday for your poem imitations, but really it's not a new skill we're practicing there. It's just a little bit of modeling. This one is a new word. I'm sure you've heard it, but I want you to think about it a lot this week. It's this concept of allusions, allusions with an A and not an I. That's going to be the focus and what you'll use in your own poems. Readings. So you have two readings this week, and the first is a wonderful poem that was recommended to us by one of your classmates. I really loved it. It's the first time I've read it. I think I have heard of it, but I had never read it. The idea is all about facing it, facing difficult things, owning those things in as much as you are able. And every poem that I've selected also has some allusions in it, and that's the case for the first poem that Eden suggested. The second poem, Middle Passage by Robert Hayden, is an epic, and that's me not giving you a subjective adjective. That's just the genre of the poem. It's a long poem. It takes about 30 minutes to read. So those two. That will be our last reading for the year. And before you get into the Middle Passage poem, I'd recommend watching this video. It's linked to the slideshow. When I try to embed it here, YouTube doesn't let me post these videos of mine, so you have to do it on your own time. But this is just a short 5-minute video about the Atlantic slave trade and some of the details about the Atlantic slave trade that might not be as well known to you, especially the African slave trade that was already in existence before Europeans came to the continent, and the difference between that African slave trade and then chattel slavery that was enacted by the Europeans who came to the African continent. That is helpful to know as you read the poem. The poem that Hayden writes is the result of 2.5 years of historical research. It's a poem, but it's really a piece of historical thinking. And so in it, Hayden makes many allusions to the real history that he learned as he did his studies. And that's why it just is going to pay off to have as much background knowledge as you can about the Atlantic slave trade. This video is helpful for that. So check that out. All right, so here is Robert Hayden. Robert Hayden wrote in the 20th century. He was born in Detroit, and he served as the first African-American in the role of U.S. Poet Laureate. So he had a lot of notoriety and success in his time. But I find it really interesting that he wrote this poem in the 40s, and he didn't publish it then. He published it in the 60s. In the 40s, the content that you're about to see in the poem maybe didn't strike America in the way that it was going to in the 60s. The America of the 40s was not ready to learn about the Atlantic slave trade, nor wanted to. It was a time of great nationalism, great patriotism. This idea of studying the history of Black people in America maybe was not as exciting to a lot of academics, though it, of course, should have been. But in the 60s, all of the early seeds of the Harlem Renaissance planted in the 20s, and then a lot of the post-war discontent had reached a fever pitch, and finally Black Americans, Black artists had a day in the mainstream where a lot of other white authors who had been more prominent in academic circles were listening. And Hayden is really a part of that community. He often asserted that he was not a Black poet, but an American poet. And he wanted to make sure that the academic circles that he traveled understood that if his poetry was going to be any good, it would be because of the poetry itself and not because of the sort of sympathy they felt for him as a Black poet. And so he wrote about that a lot. Yet he took up themes of African American history and repeatedly placed them at the center of the American experience. He, in not so many words, said, "This is our history, all of our history, all Americans' history. This is not my history, it is our history." And what you see here is a fine example of that. All right, so all of that is relevant because I'm going to be talking about allusions. Why would an author use allusions in a poem? Hayden packs dozens of allusions into his poem that dramatically alters the structure of the poem, both its content structure and its physical structure. A lot of that is drawn upon his 2 years of research that he did to write the poem. In the poem are so many primary sources, direct diary entries, snippets of text that he found in his research. So the allusions both enrich the historical content of the poem, but they also do something else. When you use an allusion, you tap into, I'm going to put it here, the connotations of what you refer to. And so if Hayden is referring to Samuel Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, as he does, he's referring to the cultural tradition of that poem. It's a very long-standing British tradition. So he, now Hayden, gets to wrap that cultural tradition up in his own poem. And I think that Hayden does this in part to own those cultural traditions, to say, these aren't your traditions, they're my traditions too. Again, back to that, they're our traditions. You don't get to tell me that I am not allowed to read Shakespeare as a Black man in America. I own Shakespeare too. I own all of these masters. They are mine, and they will come up into my poem as well as yours. So it's a way of owning. I keep using that word, owning. I'm borrowing it from Marilyn Nelson's great essay, Owning the Masters. Owning all of the cultural heritage that you choose to as a poet. And that is partly what allusion does. It also allows readers to create meaning with background knowledge. It also relies on your background knowledge. When I was in college, we read T.S. Eliot a lot. I took a small course on just Eliot, and I often felt like he was trying to lock me out. You know, there was just so many moments in Eliot's poetry where I realized he was alluding to something, but I didn't know what, and I didn't know what I didn't know. Allusion, it is a reference to something that exists outside the text. Really simple definition, right? But it becomes more complete when you look at examples. So these references could be historical, cultural, literary, mythological, religious, and you can already see how a lot of those categories are arbitrary. That something is mythological might also make it religious. That something is cultural might also make it historical. But if you're seeking categories to understand what allusions can be, here are some useful ones. How do they impact the structure? Well, like archetypes, like I said, they give shape to the piece that relies on your understanding of universal truths. And so it makes the piece seem bigger than it is, more expansive than it is. It also impacts the physical structure. In Hayden's case, the allusions are so overwhelming that they impact the structure of the poem. And here's an example. So the very first lines, I didn't include this in my annotations, desire, adventure, Tartar, Anne, are the names of ships. They're the names of what were called slavers, the ships that carried slaves from Africa to the New World. It doesn't say that. You have to infer it. They're real names of real ships. 360,000, as Clint Smith says in his poem, August 1619, that Hayden found in his research. And then, a little bit further down, Jesus, Savior, pilot me over life's tempestuous sea. Those are the lines from a traditional religious hymn. It's called Jesus, Savior, pilot me. And you can see the structure of the poem changes to show us that this is a song. There's spaces there between the words that don't mimic typical prose. It's his attempt to show you, I am quoting a hymn. Why? Why would he make this part of the poem a religious hymn? The answer is tucked into this hymn, this meaning of the poem's allusion. So this is a song by Edward Hopper. Kind of imagine this being sung in church buildings in England, especially where this was written in the same time that the slave trade was starting to take off. And the lyrics are all about a sea voyage. Jesus, Savior, pilot me over life's tempestuous sea. Chart and compass come from thee, Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Unknown waves before me roll, hiding rocks and treacherous shoal. The song is meant to be a metaphor for life's difficulties, but of course, in this poem, it's no metaphor. The slaves are being carried literally on the ocean, and it is indeed tempestuous, and their lives are indeed going to be lost, almost certainly. So the song that is religious, that is about seeking refuge, is meant to be both ironic, because the slavers who are capturing these people to bring them into bondage are singing this song. They are outwardly religious, outwardly moral, but inwardly capable of this act of human violence. And then on the other hand, it is actually trying to allude to the refuge that the slaves needed to survive this voyage, either to survive it spiritually, internally, or to literally survive it. So the two lines there, that little couplet, they inherit this tradition of a British religious hymn. Another example of an allusion, the little tercet rather here in the middle, deep in the festering hold thy father lies. Of his bones New England pews are made, those are altar lights that were his eyes. That is another allusion. That is a direct allusion to Shakespeare's The Tempest, tempestuous sea. You hear the rhythms of these metaphors all coming together in this idea of a storm. This is almost specifically the same language as Ariel's song from The Tempest, where she sings, full fathom 5, thy father lies, of his bones are coral made, those are pearls that were his eyes. Notice, stops there in its allusion. The poem that we're reading takes the idea of how the father in The Tempest changes. And instead of saying the pearls were his eyes, like his eyes become pearls, beautiful, precious things, the poem says those are altar lights that were his eyes, beautiful and precious. But in this case, the body of the man, thy father, is used to make a church. Again, the irony, the hypocrisy of that is fully on display. Hayden does not borrow the rest of Ariel's song, where the sprite sings, nothing of him that does fade, but does suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. In the drowning of the father in The Tempest, that is the hope. That's the hope of his death, that even in death, something beautiful happens, something rich and strange. And that, if you'll notice, is not borrowed into Hayden's poem. And so it has more despair, more hopelessness in the poem on purpose. We're trying in this poem to understand how difficult this was. So Hayden is using the allusion on purpose to cut off the part that has hope. There is hope in the poem, in middle passage. And I deliberately left out amazing allusions that can help you understand that hope more deeply, so you can do it on your own. There are allusions to The Tempest again. There's an allusion to another amazing poem called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. There are allusions to historical happenings, including the voyage of the Amistad, and so many more. So I'm going to leave that for you, because your task is to go back over the poems we read and then make a selection. What poem or poet do you want to choose for your poetry imitation due this Friday? If you choose middle passage, that's where you'll be looking for another allusion in middle passage. If not, you have these other poems to choose from. And if you're looking for an allusion, a good tip that I can offer is to look for a capital letter, look for a proper noun. Often that will be an allusion that's really literal to a place or a person or a historical event that's important. But the more fun allusions to find are the ones that you might not even notice unless you knew the thing they were referring to. And the examples I gave from Hayden are good examples of that. I'll go back for a moment so you can see. If you didn't know The Tempest well, then these would just skim right past your eyes. And you might notice the language is a little strange, but you wouldn't really know why. If you didn't know that, you wouldn't see this second version of a tercet that repeats in middle passage. So you don't know what you don't know, and allusions are really testing to see how deep and rich your background knowledge is for different cultural artifacts. I'm confident you'll find one, and I leave you to that task. Find an allusion to the poem. How does it work within the poem? Why is it there? Write a paragraph exploring the use of allusion in the poem with a specific example that you found. That's your task for our creative analysis today. And then Wednesday, for the organization assignment, you'll keep with that same poem and you'll write your own in its style.